There's a particular kind of tone deafness that comes from extreme wealth. In February 1897, New York City was in the grip of the worst economic depression in American history. Unemployment exceeded 20%. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Families were being evicted into winter streets. Children were starving. And on February 10th, 1897, at the Waldorf Hotel ballroom, the Bradley-Martin family threw a costume ball that cost approximately $370,000, roughly $11 million in today's currency. Before we dive into the most catastrophically mistimed display of wealth in American history, the party that was so offensive, so tone-deaf, so grotesquely excessive, that it triggered a national revolt and literally drove a family into permanent exile. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to witness is the moment when Gilded Age excess finally went too far, when one party became the symbol of everything wrong with wealth inequality, the costumes that cost more than workers earned in a lifetime, the menu that could have fed thousands, the champagne that flowed while people starved. Drop a comment telling us whether you think the Bradley-Martins deserved what happened to them, or whether they were scapegoated for a system they didn't create. This is the story of Cornelia and Bradley-Martin, a couple who had everything: wealth, social position, acceptance in the highest circles. This is the story of how they decided to throw a party to, in their words, stimulate the economy by giving employment to dressmakers, caterers, florists, and musicians. This is the story of how that party, intended to demonstrate their generosity, instead became a national scandal that destroyed their lives. And this is the story of the moment when the Gilded Age began to die, when the tolerance for excessive wealth evaporated, when the public decided that some things were unforgivable. Cornelia Sherman Martin was born in 1845 to a wealthy New York family. The Shermans were old money, respectable. Her childhood was privileged, but not extravagant. In 1869, at age 24, Cornelia married Bradley-Martin. He was from an even wealthier family, Scottish-American. His father had made a fortune in real estate and railroads. When Bradley's father died in 1881, Bradley and Cornelia inherited approximately $10 million, roughly $300 million today. This level of wealth meant they never had to work, never had to worry. Could live entirely for pleasure and social ambition. And Cornelia had ambitions. She wanted to be a leader of New York society, wanted to host events that would be talked about, wanted her name associated with elegance and excess. Throughout the 1880s and early 1890s, the Bradley-Martins threw increasingly elaborate parties, dinners for 100 guests, balls for 500, spending lavishly. They maintained homes in New York, Newport, London, and Scotland, traveled constantly, lived the lifestyle that Gilded Age wealth allowed. But by the mid-1890s, Cornelia felt she wasn't receiving enough recognition. She wasn't on Caroline Astor's 400 list, wasn't considered a true leader. She decided she needed to do something unprecedented, throw a party so magnificent, so expensive, so elaborate that it couldn't be ignored. And then came the Depression of 1893, the worst economic crisis America had experienced. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, unemployment skyrocketed, the effects lasted for years. By 1896, conditions were desperate. New York had over 70,000 unemployed workers. Charitable organizations were overwhelmed. People were literally starving. Any reasonable person would have recognized that this was not the time to throw an extravagant party. But Cornelia Bradley-Martin was not a reasonable person. Or rather, she was operating under reasoning so detached from reality that it became madness. She convinced herself that throwing an expensive party would help the economy, would provide employment, would stimulate business. She articulated this reasoning in interviews. The tradespeople, the manufacturers, the designers, they need work. By hosting a grand ball, we give them employment, we help the economy. This logic is superficially plausible. Spending money does create economic activity, but the reality is that spending $370,000 on one night of entertainment while people starved was not economic stimulus. It was obscenity. Chapter 2. The Preparation. The Bradley-Martin ball was planned for months, with obsessive attention to detail and no attention whatsoever to how it would be perceived. Cornelia decided the theme would be Versailles. Guests were instructed to come in costumes representing the French court in the era of Louis XV and Louis XVI. The irony of choosing the French aristocracy just before they were overthrown and executed apparently didn't occur to anyone involved. Invitations went out in December 1896 to 1,200 of New York's wealthiest families. The invitation itself was a work of art, engraved, gilded, delivered in silk-lined boxes. It specified that costumes should be historically accurate, that jewelry should be real, that no expense should be spared. Cornelia hired a historian to advise guests on costume accuracy. She wanted this to be an authentic recreation of Versailles. The response from New York society was immediate and enthusiastic. Families began commissioning costumes that cost thousands of dollars. One woman, identified in newspapers only as Mrs. Oliver Belmont, spent $7,000 on her costume, roughly $200,000 today. Another guest commissioned a replica of Marie Antoinette's coronation gown, cost $9,000. Took 6 seamstresses 3 months to create. The costumes became competitive, families trying to outdo each other, spending more, being more elaborate, more authentic, more expensive. Meanwhile, the Waldorf Hotel was being transformed. The ballroom was decorated to resemble the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Over 5,000 roses were brought in, along with thousands of orchids, lilies, and rare tropical flowers. The floral budget alone was $15,000. Cornelia hired the best caterers in New York. The menu was to include 60 courses, featuring delicacies imported from France, rare game, exotic fruits. 10,000 bottles of champagne were ordered, along with thousands of bottles of rare wines. An orchestra of 100 musicians was hired, along with a smaller chamber group for dinner music. The total cost for venue decoration, food, drink, and entertainment was estimated at $370,000. But that didn't include the costumes, which guests paid for themselves. Total costume expenditure was estimated at over $200,000. So the total economic cost of the ball exceeded $500,000, roughly $15 million today. For one night, for 1,200 people, for approximately 6 hours of entertainment. As preparations proceeded, word leaked to the press, and the reaction was not what the Bradley-Martins expected. Newspapers began covering the ball, not as society news but as scandal, as evidence of obscene wealth inequality. The New York Journal ran an editorial in January 1897 titled "Let Them Eat Cake," explicitly comparing the Bradley-Martins to Marie Antoinette. While thousands starve, while children beg in the streets, while men desperate for work stand in bread lines, the wealthy will gather to play dress-up in jewels worth more than most will earn in a lifetime. The New York World published the estimated cost of the ball next to statistics on unemployment and poverty. The Bradley-Martin ball will cost $370,000. This amount would feed 10,000 families for a month, would provide shelter for 5,000 homeless, would employ 1,000 workers for a year. Public anger began building, but the Bradley-Martins and their guests either didn't notice or didn't care. They proceeded with preparations, ordering more flowers, more champagne, more elaborate decorations. Cornelia gave interviews defending the ball, repeating her reasoning that it would stimulate the economy. "We are doing this for the working people," she told the New York Times. "The dressmakers, the caterers, Everyone who is employed by this event, they should be grateful. This statement, suggesting that hungry workers should be grateful that the rich were spending money on a party, was perhaps the worst thing she could have said. It crystallized the public perception that the wealthy were completely disconnected, that they genuinely believed their excess was charity. Chapter 3. The Night of Infamy. February 10th, 1897, the night of the Bradley-Martin ball, arrived with New York in a state of barely controlled rage. Outside the Waldorf Hotel, over 5,000 people gathered, not to admire the arriving guests but to jeer at them. Police had been called in to control the crowd. Over 200 officers were deployed, forming barriers between the protesters and the hotel entrance. As carriages arrived carrying guests in their elaborate costumes, the crowd shouted, booed, threw things. "Shame!" they yelled. "While we starve, you dance! Parasites! Bloodsuckers! Let them eat cake!" The anger was palpable, dangerous. Police worried the crowd might riot. Inside the Waldorf, 1,200 guests pretended not to hear the shouting, pretended the anger outside didn't exist. The ballroom was magnificent, transformed into a reasonable approximation of Versailles, flowers everywhere, crystal chandeliers, gilt mirrors. The costumes were extraordinary. Newspaper accounts described them in detail that now reads as obscene. Cornelia Bradley-Martin herself came as Mary, Queen of Scots, wearing a ruby necklace that had actually belonged to Mary, reportedly worth $200,000, $6 million today. Her dress was cloth of gold embroidered with pearls. The costume cost an estimated $30,000. Bradley-Martin came as Louis XV, wearing a costume reproduced from historical paintings, covered in gold embroidery, diamonds on his shoes. Mrs. John Jacob Astor came as a 17th century Venetian lady, wearing emeralds worth $300,000, $9 million today. One guest, identified as Mr. Belmont, came wearing actual armor from the 15th century that he'd purchased from a museum in Europe, cost $15,000. The costumes weren't just expensive, they were aggressively expensive, deliberately, performatively wasteful. The dinner was served at midnight, 60 courses, beginning with oysters and caviar, progressing through consommé, terrapin, game birds, rare beef, exotic fruits. Each course was paired with different wines, champagne flowing constantly. Contemporary accounts describe guests so stuffed with food and drunk on wine that they could barely dance. The orchestra played Strauss waltzes. Guests danced in their elaborate costumes, jewels glittering under chandeliers. At one point, Cornelia gave a speech thanking everyone for attending, for supporting her vision, for helping to stimulate the economy. She was apparently unaware of the irony, apparently didn't hear the shouting outside. The ball continued until 4 a.m, guests departing through side entrances to avoid the still present crowd. Outside, the protesters had been reinforced throughout the night. Newspapers had published the addresses of attendees. Crowds gathered at various mansions. When Mrs. Astor's carriage arrived at her home, a crowd of over 100 people was waiting, shouting, throwing garbage. Several guests reported rocks thrown at their carriages, windows broken. The anger wasn't abstract anymore. It was personal, directed, dangerous. Chapter 4. The Backlash. The morning after the Bradley-Martin ball, newspapers across America published scathing coverage. The New York Journal's front page showed photographs of starving children next to illustrations of guests in their jewels. "While they danced, children starved," read the headline. The article detailed the cost of the ball, itemized the waste, calculated how many people could have been fed, employed, housed with that money. The New York World published the guest list with home addresses, an act that would be considered doxing today. "These are the people who believe their excess is charity," the article stated. These are the people who dance while you starve. Public anger exploded. The ball became a symbol of everything wrong with Gilded Age inequality. Within days, protest marches were organized. Thousands of unemployed workers marched to the homes of ball attendees. At the Bradley-Martin mansion on 20th Street, a crowd of over 2,000 gathered, chanting, demanding that the family be exiled. Police had to be called to disperse the crowd. Several arrests were made. The Bradley-Martins received death threats, letters threatening to burn their house, to kill them, to destroy everything they owned. They hired private security, guards posted at their home 24 hours a day. But the threats weren't just from angry mobs, they came from the government too. The New York City tax assessor, a political appointee who understood public mood, announced that the Bradley-Martin ball had revealed the family's wealth. The family's property assessments were raised dramatically. Their tax bill increased by over $20,000 annually. This was political, a way to punish them for the ball, to demonstrate that there were consequences. Other ball attendees faced similar reassessments. The city was using tax policy as punishment. Religious leaders condemned the ball from pulpits. Sermons across New York denounced the excess, the waste, the indifference to suffering. The Episcopal Bishop of New York, Henry Codman Potter, gave a sermon explicitly naming the Bradley-Martins. They have sinned against the poor. They have celebrated their wealth while their neighbors starved, and they will answer to God for this cruelty. Labor unions organized boycotts of businesses owned by ball attendees. The American Federation of Labor published a list of ball participants, encouraging members to refuse to patronize their businesses. Several businesses saw significant declines in revenue. Some had to close locations. The backlash was total, comprehensive, coming from every direction. And crucially, it didn't stay contained to New York. The story spread nationally, then internationally. European newspapers covered it as evidence of American excess, of capitalism run amok. Socialist newspapers used it as propaganda, proof that the wealthy were parasites. The Bradley-Martin ball became one of the most reported events of 1897, known worldwide as a symbol of obscene inequality. For the Bradley-Martins personally, the situation became unbearable. They couldn't leave their house without being recognized, shouted at, sometimes physically threatened. Their friends began distancing themselves, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. Even within high society, there was acknowledgement that they had gone too far, that the ball had been a mistake. Caroline Astor, who had attended, privately told friends that the Bradley-Martins had been foolish and reckless. They have harmed us all. Because the backlash wasn't just against the Bradley-Martins, it was against the entire system of Gilded Age excess. The ball had exposed how wide the gap between rich and poor had become, had made visible the grotesque inequality, and once visible, it couldn't be unseen. Chapter 5. The Exile. By May 1897, just 3 months after the ball, the Bradley-Martins made a decision. They would leave America permanently. They couldn't live in New York anymore. The hatred was too intense, the threats too credible. But they also couldn't simply move to another American city. The scandal had spread nationwide. They were notorious everywhere. So they chose exile. They would move to England, live there permanently, never return. The decision was reported in newspapers as the Bradley-Martins flee, presented as cowardice, as the rich running away rather than facing consequences. In truth, they were being driven out. The backlash had made their continued residence in America impossible. They left in June 1897, taking most of their possessions, leaving their New York mansion to be sold. The sale of the mansion was itself newsworthy. It sold for far less than its value because no one wanted to be associated with the Bradley-Martin name. The proceeds, along with the rest of their fortune, was transferred to British banks. They settled in London initially, renting a townhouse in Mayfair, trying to re-establish themselves in British high society. But the scandal had crossed the Atlantic. British newspapers had covered the ball. British society knew who they were. They were received because their money was real and titles could still be impressed by American millions, but they were never fully accepted. They were always the Americans who had thrown that obscene ball, who had been driven out of their own country. Cornelia tried to recreate her social ambitions in London, hosting parties, trying to become a hostess. But British society in the 1900s was different, less ostentatious, more reserved. Her style didn't translate. And she was competing with British aristocracy, who had centuries of social position, not just money. She spent the rest of her life trying to achieve the social prominence she'd lost, never succeeding. Bradley-Martin died in 1913 in Scotland, their adopted country, never having returned to America. Cornelia lived until 1920, dying in London. Still in exile 23 years after the ball, their children and grandchildren remained in Britain. The family essentially became British, severing ties with America. The Bradley-Martin name, once associated with wealth and social ambition, became synonymous with excess and tone deafness. "Don't be a Bradley-Martin" became a phrase used in Gilded Age society, meaning don't flaunt wealth inappropriately, don't misjudge public mood. Chapter 6. The Legacy of One Night. The Bradley-Martin ball had consequences far beyond one family's exile. It marked a turning point in American attitudes toward wealth. Before the ball, Gilded Age excess was celebrated, or at least tolerated. The wealthy flaunted their fortunes and the public accepted it as the natural order. After the ball, that tolerance began to erode. Displays of extreme wealth became politically dangerous, socially unacceptable. The progressive era, which began in the late 1890s, was partly a reaction to the Bradley-Martin ball. The ball made visible the inequality that had been building for decades, made it undeniable, unacceptable. Within a few years, reform movements gained power, income taxes were proposed, antitrust legislation was passed, labor rights were expanded. The ball became a rallying point, proof that the system was broken, that wealth inequality had reached obscene levels. Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901, explicitly referenced the ball in speeches about the need for wealth redistribution. When the wealthy celebrate with champagne while workers starve in the streets, when parties cost what would feed thousands, we have failed as a society, Roosevelt said in 1902. The ball also changed how the wealthy themselves behaved. After 1897, ostentatious displays decreased. The super-wealthy became more discreet, more conscious of public perception, more careful about flaunting excess. Parties continued, but they were smaller, more private, less likely to be publicized. The era of 1,000-person balls in hotel ballrooms essentially ended with the Bradley-Martin ball. Wealthy families learned that there were limits, that the public would only tolerate so much. The ball also accelerated the decline of the Gilded Age social system. Caroline Astor's 400, the rigid social hierarchy, the obsession with European titles, all of it began to seem archaic after 1897. The world was changing, democracy was strengthening, and the ball had demonstrated that aristocratic pretension wouldn't be tolerated. Within 20 years, World War I would destroy European aristocracy, and with it, the American worship of European titles. The Bradley-Martin ball was a preview, an early demonstration that the old order was dying. Today, the ball is remembered, when it's remembered at all, as a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when the wealthy become so disconnected that they can't see how they appear to others. A demonstration that there are consequences to excess, that tolerance has limits. The parallels to today are obvious. When billionaires launch themselves into space while people can't afford healthcare. When tech executives throw parties costing millions while their workers need food stamps. When wealth inequality reaches levels not seen since the Gilded Age, the Bradley-Martin ball shows us what can happen, shows us that the public won't tolerate everything forever. That one party, one display, one moment of grotesque excess can become the symbol that changes everything. Cornelia Bradley-Martin thought she was stimulating the economy. She thought she was being generous, providing employment, demonstrating refined taste. Instead, she triggered a backlash that destroyed her life, drove her from her country, and helped end an era. The party that was supposed to cement her social position became the party that made her name synonymous with tone-deaf excess. The ball she thought would be remembered as the pinnacle of Gilded Age elegance is instead remembered as the moment when Gilded Age excess finally went too far. When the public said enough, when the tolerance broke, when the whole rotten system was exposed. One night, 6 hours, $370,000, and it changed everything. That's the legacy of the Bradley-Martin ball. Not elegance, but infamy. Not celebration, but revolt. Not the party of the century, but the party that ended an era and forced a family into exile forever. If the Bradley-Martin ball's catastrophic tone deafness shocked you, and if you think the rich need to be reminded what happens when they push too far, subscribe immediately. Drop a comment telling us what modern equivalent you see to the Bradley-Martin ball. Which billionaire party or display makes you think we're heading for the same backlash? And share this video because the story of how one obscene party drove a family into permanent exile is a warning that needs to be heard. Especially now, subscribe now, because understanding that the Bradley-Martin ball destroyed not just one family, but helped end an entire era. Shows us that public tolerance has limits, that wealth inequality can't grow forever, that eventually there's a reckoning. The next story we're covering is another moment when the Gilded Age elite pushed too far and faced consequences they never imagined.